Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Bourke. Well, it's my great pleasure to have on the podcast this week Stephanie Baker, a journalist at Bloomberg in London and author of a brand new book, Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Stephanie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Stephanie, I must admit, I picked up this book with somewhat hesitation and a little trepidation because sanctions has been one of those words in the reporting world where your eyes automatically glaze over and you know that your reader's eyes are about to glaze over. And yet you set out to write an entire book about sanctions. What was your mission and goal with this?
I really wanted to make this understandable to a wide audience and accessible to people who don't understand economics, geopolitics, and particularly how to decode a U.S. Treasury press release which goes into these details of, rolling out sanctions or export controls against this entity or that entity. So I really wanted to use explanatory journalism skills to show how important this economic war is in terms of the West's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and point out where the weaknesses were and how they could be strengthened. But I also just realized that there were incredibly dramatic stories that were unfolding before my eyes. Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of assets being locked down and frozen as a result of sanctions. Everything from Russian billionaires, who were sanctioned in Europe, US, and the UK, having their mansions frozen, super yachts seized, to wonky debates that I tried to tell through the characters involved. So trying to bring it home to readers in a way that did not make their eyes glaze over. And I had an interesting piece of advice from my editor who was like, Stephanie, your job is to make sure that your reader doesn't put your book down. They've got a lot of other things to do. So make sure they don't want to put it down and go do the dishes or what have you. You've got to keep them hooked. And every time there was a sort of piece of jargon that came up or whatever, I just was like, okay, no, I've got to just make this almost like a pacey thriller.
Well, I think I can safely say mission accomplished, Stephanie, because I picked this book up, as I said, with just a little bit of hesitation, but I knew it was you. And what unfolded was an absolutely gripping read. And it's turned out to be the best book I've read all year. It was so interesting. I learned so much about sanctions, how they came about, but also the relationship with Russia through this economic frontier of warfare that you describe. But let's go back to the start. How did your journalistic relationship with Russia begin?
Right. So I was a young journalist in Moscow in the 1990s, a very chaotic period. And it's when I fell into covering economics and business because the big story in the 1990s was obviously massive privatization, this huge transfer of wealth as Russia moved away from a planned economy into a market economy. And so I had a first row seat to this massive transfer of wealth and the rise of the first wave of Russia's so-called oligarchs. And I go into that in the book because I think you can't understand the current war against Russia right now without understanding that period and how we got here. The 1990s and the sort of economic trauma that many Russians experienced during that period, I think really does help to explain the rise of a figure like Putin, as well as Putin's rise and how he benefited from the booming price of oil in particular. A lot of people think that Putin was some, fantastic economic manager, when in reality, he was just profiting from a global commodities boom. So, I've gone back to Russia periodically since the 1990s to do big interviews with Russian billionaires or stories on Russia. So it's always been sort of pulling me back in one way or another, and I was able to draw on some of that reporting for the book.
Have you been back since the war began?
No, I have not, and I did not go for this book because I deemed it too risky to travel to Russia. I hired a Russian reporter to be my eyes and ears on the ground and sent him out with various reporting requests. And ironically, he's been forced to leave now because of threats against his own safety.
Because of this work, particularly?
Not because of this work, but I just think the situation in Russia has become so much harder for any kind of reporting, even by Russian journalists.
So Do you think you'll ever go back to Russia? Are you sanctioned? Is it your hope that you go back to Russia one day?
I don't think I'll be able to go back to Russia for the foreseeable future. The situation will have to change quite dramatically for me to feel safe enough to go back. I'm not sanctioned, but I would imagine writing a book like this has put me on some watch list. So no, I would not feel safe going back. And I don't think anyone should be going there to be, pawns in Russia's prisoner swap game. I think it's too dangerous.
Stephanie, I was very grateful for the chapter on that 1990s era because I think for people of my age, so I'm 40, we missed out on this part of Russia's arc because we were young kids at this point in time. And by the time I think Russia arrives on the scene in a geopolitical way, it's scary and confronting. And so for me, as an Australian, one of the most searing moments was MH17. Crimea was not necessarily something we heard about, but MH17 was. And what I really took out of that chapter that you wrote on the 90s was also that level of optimism and hope that was inside Russia, but also in the West. And I think that also draws a thread to where we find ourselves now with the Western companies who built up in Russia with the hope that Russia was going down a different sort of path. How do you think that story has led to what we see now, these companies trying to unravel themselves from Russia, how easy and difficult that was, and what are the lessons going forward for how countries might want to integrate into countries emerging from situations like Russia in the future?
Right. So the 90s saw this wave of investment into Russia by Western companies who were eager to get a slice of the Russian market, this huge consumer market. And it was really difficult. It was a very difficult investment climate, very uncertain. But I think there was a belief at that time that it was just a matter of transitioning Russia away from central planning, that yes, it was going to be a rough ride, but that making Russia into a capitalist democracy would happen over a number of years, that as long as you transition the economy, maybe the democratic institutions would follow. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes that was made, is that the foundations of Russia's democracy were sort of put on the back burner in the hopes that the economic transformation would be the thing that would really move Russia into the West and be part of the world's democracies. What you saw since 2022 is all these Western companies kind of hoping that this would blow over so that their 3 decades of investment could be protected. Now, for a lot of these companies, Russia's percentage of their revenue, their global revenue, was relatively small. But a lot of them had physical assets. It built up over a number of years within Russia that they did not want to just abandon. And I think some of them felt a degree of responsibility towards their Russian employees who they did not want to just jettison. So you saw Western companies, some of whom called it early and quickly. I go into the story of McDonald's.
I loved this chapter, actually.
Right. So initially, McDonald's was quite slow, actually. The first 10 days after the full-scale invasion, they didn't say anything about what they were going to do in Russia, while other companies were saying they were going to suspend operations or what have you. But then actually McDonald's quickly pivoted, and I kind of hold them out as the model of how a lot of these Western companies should have acted, because they made the call by April of 2022 that it was time to get out. They sold to a local franchise partner, and they were able to exercise a degree of control over the terms of their exit. They picked who they wanted. They drove a hard bargain in terms of trying to protect their brand and their image. Some of the companies that stayed, hoping to either get a better deal or, in a false hope that the war might end soon, they ended up paying a much steeper price because Putin quickly narrowed the exit doors. He later imposed a requirement that companies selling had to agree to a 50% discount to market value, had to pay taxes to the Russian government. He's increased those costs just recently. So, you see companies like Unilever, for instance, who just recently announced they were getting out 2.5 years after the full-scale invasion.
What took them so long, some might ask?
It's a really good question. I think in many respects, many companies said they would stop importing goods, but it is very tricky for them to get out. There's no doubt about it. But I do think that it was a bad look for those companies that stayed and continued paying taxes to the Russian government, because that was indirectly funding Putin's war machine. And I think you'll see more companies trying to get out. And many of them, even the ones who got out early, McDonald's, had to take massive hits to their balance sheets. And so there's certainly costs of getting out, but I think it is the right thing to do.
And then it led to these copycat scenarios, which I found absolutely fascinating. So in some respects, Russians are still enjoying McDonald's. It's just under a different name, right?
Yes, exactly. They rebranded as Vkusna I Tochka, which means tasty and that's it. You had other companies like Starbucks, which sold to a local entrepreneur and a pro-Putin rap artist, and they rebranded as Stars Coffee.
It's not exactly subtle, is it?
And the logo looks incredibly similar to the Starbucks mermaid. So, yeah, I mean, they were an example of someone who didn't drive a hard bargain in terms of protecting their brand, and I think that was costly for them, not only for their bottom line, but for their image. And there's talk of like the Stars Coffee, the replacement isn't as good. But I think that's the case with many of these copycat brands. They may be able to keep it going for a little while, but I think that's going to quickly fade away, and it'll be hard for them to keep up the standards of the Western companies that were there before.
Because the supply lines are just not there, right?
Well, they've had to replace the supply chains for sure. I mean, the McDonald's replacement was able to replicate those supply chains quite effectively by buying up the local
because
companies.
McDonald's had, as you document, had spent so much money building up domestic supply chains, right?
Exactly. So the guy who bought it, this Siberian former coal miner, was able to get some loans from government-controlled banks to buy up some of the packaging companies and other supply chain companies as well.
Do we have any evidence or insight into how ordinary Russians felt about the effects of these sanctions? They see their popular brands ripped away from them, things in the supermarket become a lot more expensive. Were sanctions counterproductive in helping the Russian people, any of whom might have wanted to rise up against Putin, or do you think that this was just an inevitable fait accompli where we find ourselves?
Well, I think in many respects you see a lot of the Western brands who got out of Russia, you see their products on the shelves anyway through a system of parallel imports. You've got Apple iPhones being imported from China or other former Soviet states. You have Western cars, German cars like Audi being smuggled in through the likes of Georgia or the Baltic states. That was something one of my reporter that I hired told me about. So on that level, in some respects, things haven't changed. Of course, there has been rampant inflation in Russia, and sanctions have been part of that, but it's not the only reason for the high inflation. Putin's record spending on the war, both defense factories as well as the bonuses he's showered on soldiers to go fight in his meat grinder in Ukraine, that has contributed to inflation. And you've seen the response from the Russian central bank to hike interest rates to 19%. I mean, can you imagine if, we were dealing with interest rates at 19%? That would begin to hurt. I think that Putin has tried to position this as the West is against us, and these sanctions are not our fault. It's because the West hates us. And I think because he controls the messaging, he controls the media, he's been quite effective at advancing that message. But I did notice when I was talking to some people, I think some of the Russians that worked for these Western companies over the years, I don't think they're crazy about this. I think they prefer to work for big global companies. But the situation is what it is, and many of them can't just pick up and leave.
Okay, so let's extrapolate a bit. Let's go to the start of the full-scale invasion and the decision US-led, EU-backed and supported to impose sanctions in the first place. Firstly, let's talk about what a sanction is and what the sanction imposers were trying to achieve when the full-scale invasion happens.
Okay, so sanctions are kind of a tool in between diplomacy and a kinetic war. And when they're imposed on an individual, it usually involves asset freezes and travel bans. Again, when they're imposed on a company, it will also mean asset freezes and just a ban on doing business in that country or in that country's currency, which is why U.S. sanctions are so effective, because the dollar is so widely used around the world. The goal of sanctions is about behavior change. However, I think in the case of Russia, it quickly became clear that sanctions weren't a great tool to bring about a change in Putin's behavior. He was intent on invading Ukraine. It was going to be very hard to change his calculus on any potential withdrawal. So it quickly shifted to, how do we use sanctions to bleed him of the resources to sustain the war? And I think that as a goal, you saw the sanctions change in their nature by going after Russia's oil revenues, and in particular going after Russia's access to technology that it needs for its production of precision-guided weaponry. And I think those are the two fronts in the economic war that are the most important, but also the most difficult to enforce.
We'll come back to enforcement, but I want to ask about the oligarchs. There's a few of them you profile quite heavily in your book, one you even go and interview. What's the point of sanctioning the oligarchs?
Okay, so I think there was, on one level, there was a hope that sanctioning Russia's elite would expose the level of corruption at the top around Putin, that going after some of their mega assets and showing what they owned, that would be a message that would go out to the wider Russian populace that they were just getting ripped off. I think that there might have been some that thought sanctioning the Russian oligarchs would force them to turn on Putin.
Yeah.
But I think that's a misplaced analysis. And I think there were others that knew that that was not going to happen.
And we never saw that happen, did we?
And we didn't see it happen.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it, there are a circle of oligarchs around Putin who got rich because of him. Some of them were friends from St. Petersburg, where he grew up. They got rich off of state contracts or appointments at state companies. And so turning on Putin would mean putting a question mark over their own wealth and their own assets and how they acquired them. So that wasn't going to work. Sanctioning the first wave oligarchs, the ones who got rich in the 1990s, well, Putin doesn't really like them for the most part. He's co-opted them into his mafia state, as I like to call it. Very difficult for them to maneuver. They operate with his blessing and are under, the constant fear of having their assets seized, as well as all their operations put at risk. So I don't think it's a great way of necessarily bringing about regime change, although I do think it has destabilized Russia's elite because they are quite unhappy about having their way of life in the West taken away from them. But I do think it's an important way of going after the overall war economy, because let's face it, all these guys are part of the DNA of the Russian economy. They're building blocks of Putin's state and are therefore, I think, worthy targets of sanctions, because if you want to go after the war economy, these guys control huge swathes of the economy, and it's very hard to avoid the war economy at this point. Whether or not you own an insurance company or a steel producer or even a supermarket chain, you're going to feed into this either directly through working with the Russian security services or the Russian military, or indirectly by paying huge taxes to the Russian state, which they then use to keep the war going. So I think in that sense, it's a totally valid strategy to be sanctioning these guys.
Let's come back to enforcement. There's this wonderful anecdote that you chart in the book about this yacht that the Americans successfully impound or seize, but then what?
Yeah, exactly. So this was the splashy move by the U.S. Justice Department, which set up this task force called the Klepto Capture Task Force. And it tapped a prosecutor who had been working on some of these cases, tracking some of these sanctioned oligarchs. Because if you remember, in 2018, the U.S. sanctioned about 7 of these tycoons. And so they had this track record to go look at them and see if they were actually adhering to the sanctions or violating them. So when the full-scale invasion happened, they zeroed in on this super yacht that was in the Caribbean, asked the Mexicans to search it. It ended up in Fiji, and FBI agents were there ready to seize it. What happened thereafter was that it turned into this incredible legal saga where a Russian billionaire came forward saying he was the owner. The Justice Department said, no, that was false. He was just being used as the clean, unsanctioned front for a sanctioned Russian billionaire. And this has been fought out in a U.S. court for the past 2.5 years. Thousands of pages of legal documents with new revelations every month. I'm tracking it as we speak.
So this case is still ongoing?
It's still ongoing because the U.S. seized it in Fiji, sailed it to San Diego. They had to do a refit of this yacht at the cost of something like $5.5 million.
And who is paying for this?
The U.S. government is paying for it.
Wow.
Now, the idea, of course, is that they want to sell this yacht under forfeiture laws in the U.S. and channel the proceeds to Ukraine, which is, I think, another example of this isn't just a populist push, but it could actually create real revenue for Ukraine. This yacht is worth $325 million. I think the value has dropped since it's been seized, but it's proven to be much harder because, in fairness, they're going through legal procedures, as they should. It is being governed by the rule of law, and the idea is eventually that the U.S. government will be able to sell it, and they'll recoup those costs at the end of the day.
But do you think the difficulty will make them think twice next time?
Well, I think the reason why this is such an interesting story is that it gets at how Russians hold their assets through layers of shell companies in offshore jurisdictions. And it's often very hard to figure out what's going on. I mean, this is something, we deal with not just in Russia, but, Chinese investors. The offshore shell game has been used by the Russians in a way like no one's ever really done before. And it is quite hard because the way Russians hold their assets, it's not always a reflection of who owns it on paper, but who controls it and who maintains it, who's using it, et cetera. And that's actually a really hard argument to make in a U.S. court.
A second aspect of enforcement is the difficulty in coordinating the various jurisdictions, even some of those jurisdictions who talk a very big game about sanctions, talk a very big game about holding Vladimir Putin to account. I'm thinking here the UK. Can you explain some of the difficulties the US encountered when trying to enforce sanctions with some of its like-minded partners?
Right. So the problem with the UK is they hadn't really sanctioned many of these Russians before February 2022. So when the U.S. came knocking, as they were tracking some of the sanctioned oligarchs, prior to that, they weren't getting much cooperation. In fairness, I think the UK has really moved dramatically to stand up a sanctions regime almost from scratch and has really cracked down on Russian money in London. They've frozen something like £22 billion worth of assets. I'm not saying it's job done. There's certainly, and I've been reporting, looking at this now, there are structures in place that are being used to evade sanctions with companies set up in the UK, et cetera. So it's not a completely rosy picture, but I think they have moved quite dramatically. The problem the UK has is it doesn't have the kind of resources or skill set for enforcement that, for instance, I think the U.S. has developed over a number of years. The FBI have been doing this, cracking down on white-collar crime. They know how to run an investigation like this. The UK's National Crime Agency is not nearly as good, and it doesn't have the kind of resources. And I go into some examples, these anecdotes in my book of botched raids on oligarch mansions by the UK's National Crime Agency. I think they're getting better at it, but they don't have that history of going after white-collar cases. They're very, the UK enforcement is very good at drug gangs, but they're just trying to unpack these wily Russian billionaires who kind of know how to play this game is much harder.
So a lesson is that if we are to sanction, we have to back it up.
Absolutely. The sanctions are meaningless without enforcement. And I think that's what we've learned since 2022, that there were sanctions imposed after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, sanctions rolled out in 2018 under pressure from Congress in the U.S., but they weren't really properly enforced. So they don't provide a sort of messaging exercise, even if they're not enforced.
And then I think the third and final pillar that we have trouble enforcing sanctions is the parallel imports, which you spoke about before. sanctions circumvention deliberately by a lot of Russia's friends and new authoritarian partners. And then also deliberately, a lot of people deliberately selling Russia dual-use goods. You found some extraordinary cases in the United States, for example, of people living in suburban streets trying to ship these goods into Russia. Are sanctions, do they have a hard limit of their effectiveness for as long as there are countries in the world that are willing to help the bad guys circumvent them?
I think sanctions are a limited tool, and I think the effectiveness depends on the number of countries that are in the coalition. I think that's been one of the problems, that even though we have a coalition behind the Russia sanctions that represents roughly half of the world's GDP, Europe, US, UK, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, but that's still not enough, because there are countries, particularly on Russia's borders, that are helping Russia evade and profiting off of that. And so, yes, you've seen banks in places like Kazakhstan being set up for, moving money in and out of Russia, as well as shipping components. But of course, the big one on the semiconductor trade to Russia has been China and Hong Kong, and I've done bit of reporting on that. In the book, I go into a couple of cases that the Justice Department brought against these two guys living in the United States who were working, one of whom was working directly with an FSB, Russian intelligence officer in Estonia. And I just thought that was really fascinating and unique, because I don't think it's every day that you have, this guy was a Russian-Ukrainian in New Hampshire, working in direct contact with a Russian intelligence officer. So that kind of shows the extent to which Russia was going to try to get its hands on the microelectronic chips that it needs for its defense factories. Now, that case is still ongoing as well.
You gave him your card and said, if you ever want to tell your side of the story, call me. Did he ever call you?
He did not call me.
Surprise, surprise.
He threatened to have me arrested.
Well, here you are,
knocking on his door.
Here you are, safe and sound in London at Bloomberg. Stephanie, the thing I really hadn't appreciated until I read your book was how deliberate a front of warfare the people imposing these sanctions saw this. So it's a kind of economic warfare that they're opening up. And also what I think you explain very well is how unprecedented this is. So I guess here's two questions in one. Are sanctions working? And what does it show us about a confrontation involving China, which is going to be a far more difficult and complex task because our economies are far more dependent on China than they ever were on Russia?
Right. So I did see this as a big experiment in economic warfare, because here you have a nuclear power invading a sovereign neighbor. And so how do you respond to that? And I think that made the economic response really central, because they did not want to get engaged in a direct military conflict with a nuclear power. So I think that they did have to think outside the box on a number of ways of responding. I think that the sanctions are working insofar as they're imposing meaningful costs on the Russian economy.
Really? I mean, we read all these stories about Russian economic growth being far higher than Western Europe's.
Well, if you look at it, take whatever measure you want, capital flight, the frozen Russian central bank reserves, is $300 billion pot of money that the West froze right after the invasion. What it's had to pay for assembling its shadow fleet of oil tankers, the higher price for semiconductors. I'm not saying that this is a grand success, but I think people need to realize that actually, where would we be if we hadn't done this? I think Russia would be having a much easier time waging this war. I think we've imposed meaningful costs, and I think the sanctions can be strengthened to impose even greater costs. But I try to fight back this notion that sanctions aren't working, because I actually think that's what Putin wants everyone to believe, because he wants them to be lifted. He views the sanctions as unfair, and if you look at what's happening in the Russian economy right now, it is beginning to feel the pressure. I talked about the high inflation, high interest rates. The economy is expected to slow next year to about 1, maybe 1.5%, if that, % growth in 2025. It's facing massive labor shortages, and I think it's one of the reasons why they're increasing ties with North Korea. I think there's concern that they're going to turn to North Korea for labor. There are these reports that North Korean military personnel are working either in Ukraine or with the Russian military. They don't have enough manpower to staff the defense factories as well as recruit for the meat grinder in Ukraine. And I think Russia needs to recruit something like 500,000 soldiers in the next year. I mean, the casualty rate is something like 1,200 a day. So I do think that the pressures are building. And I think you've seen measures like just today, for instance, the UK announced that it was going to impose sanctions on 18 oil tankers as part of Russia's shadow fleet and another 4 tankers that were shipping liquefied natural gas. And they're going to start checking these tankers to see if they actually have insurance behind them, because that's been the real concern, is that Russia's putting oil onto these rusty old tankers with insurance in Russia that we don't know if they're going to honor if there's an oil spill. So I think actually enforcement could really drive down Russia's oil revenues quite substantially. So I guess what I'm trying to argue is just because they're not working as well as they could do doesn't mean we should give up.
Okay, and part 2 of that question. If the Indo-Pacific opens up as a theatre of war, and a couple of weeks ago interviewed Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the former Indo-Pacific Minister for the UK, asking her about how the UK would respond to a Taiwan incident, and she says we would basically sanction the hell out of China. What does China have to fear from the sanctions if they haven't crippled Russia yet after nearly 3 years of war?
Right, so Russia had hydrocarbons, oil and gas. China has its manufacturing capacity. It accounts for something like a third of global manufacturing capacity. So obviously, the West is very limited as to what it can do if China invades Taiwan or imposes a blockade, because we'd be cutting ourselves off from all the goods that we rely on that are being produced in China. I think China's watching what's happening with Russia, and I think it's served as a warning as to that, there are costs. This is not easy. China has helped Russia get through this, and I'm not sure that Russia can help China get through this. But I do think it shows the limitations of sanctions as a tool, particularly against an adversary like China, should they go ahead. Because one of the things I explore in the book is if you're going to be waging war, the key is to make sure that you're not imposing costs on your own economy that are greater than those you're imposing on your adversary.
Yes.
And I think, as I said, in both cases, you can't be blocking Russian oil without causing a global recession, and you can't be blocking exports from China likewise without causing massive economic upheaval. So I think there are inbuilt limitations given the globalized nature of the economy that we're in right now.
Do you think it will stop the imposition of sanctions in the first place?
I think there will definitely be an economic response, sanctions against China if they go ahead with an invasion of Taiwan. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But they're going to have to tread very carefully, and I think they will tread very carefully. And it's part of the reason why you have, like Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, he likes to talk about de-risking supply chains from China, which we learned after the pandemic. He doesn't like decoupling.
Actually, the European Union came up with this term first, I think, and
They
then
did.
the Americans adopted it, which was very intriguing, and then the G7 adopted it, and now it's the fashionable word all around.
Exactly. But that is a long-term process, and I'm not sure we've got that long. Part of the reason why I think this war is so important is I think what happens in Ukraine could determine what Beijing does. I think that if Ukraine loses and Russia wins, I think that will only embolden China to move ahead.
And just finally, you talked about China watching how sanctions are being imposed and enforced or otherwise. What is business learning? Because the global business community, as you chart so wonderfully in your book, goes in with all this optimism about what it can achieve in post-Soviet Russia, gets incredibly burnt a couple of decades later, and now you see them leaving on their own terms or not. What do you think that is showing Western businesses who are doing business in China right now?
I mean, I think a lot of them are moving some limited manufacturing out of China. They are de-risking, but there's only so much you can do on that. I mean, you see other countries like Vietnam really benefiting from that move. I think China is just too big to affect that kind of change overnight. And just the volume of goods coming out of China is just so enormous that it's like turning around a massive tanker. It's going to take too long. But, it's the big debate now. We see it playing out in the U.S. With Trump threatening massive tariffs on China. And, unfortunately, I think there's not enough understanding in his circles as to the potential economic fallout of that strategy. So, I think it's one of the toughest challenges we have. We went through this 3 decades of globalization, this extraordinary period. My entire adult career watching this happen. And now it's being unraveled very slowly because of the risks involved. And there are costs involved. There are costs as part of that, for sure.
Stephanie Baker, we've come to that point in the podcast where you now may ask me anything if you so desire. So fire away.
Yeah, so I know nothing about Australia.
But I won't hold that against you. It's fine.
But I would like to ask, one of the remarkable things about the war in Ukraine is how divisive it's been as an issue politically in the United States. Trump and Kamala Harris, very different views on this. But actually how unified the United Kingdom has been across the political spectrum. The Labour Party and the Tory Party both strongly support Ukraine. Is that true in Australia?
Well, it's a great question because it's a little bit nuanced. Yes, in terms of public support, the polling is absolutely rock solid and sky high. So around 3/4 or more of Australians supporting Ukraine. They support Australia doing either existing contributions or increasing military aid to Ukraine. So these are pretty strong numbers. Politically, yes, both sides say we absolutely stand for the rules-based order. This is similar to some of the issues we ourselves face, so we understand your fight, Ukraine. But we did see when the government changed at the start of the war, it was a centre-right government. After about a couple of months, it became a left-wing government. And we did see a slowing of tempo in terms of how much military aid was being contributed and of the quality. And we had some really embarrassing incidents in Australia. One earlier this year where instead of sending helicopters that were being decommissioned, the Australian government chose to bury them, despite Ukraine asking for them. Yes, Stephanie, your reaction is perfect. If only I could describe it to you. It was a jaw dropping to the floor. And that was a big embarrassment in Australia. It was a scandal and a bit of a controversy. We closed our embassy at the time that a lot of Western countries closed their embassies. In contrast, all of those countries, including the Canadians who we shared our embassy with in Kyiv, have reopened and gone back in the same year. Ours remains closed. We're an outlier and we sit in Warsaw and we cite occupational health and safety legislation for that, which is just mind-numbing.
Gosh.
But the upside is there's been a lot of pressure put on the government for this. And because there's very high popular support, the government is reacting. And so yesterday we saw a great announcement, 49 of the Abrams tanks that they're US made, Australian owned, but of course they're already in operation in Ukraine thanks to the US. They are going to now be sent automatically to Ukraine rather than whatever else fate might have met them as they're being decommissioned. So that's a significant change in the government's posture. They've reacted very well to the demands from the Ukrainian and Australian community on that. So there's a lot more we could be doing. And certainly from my position, I would argue that Australia sometimes, and I see this a lot in the government, has a view that Europe is over there, it's far away, we're focused on the Indo-Pacific. But I think what's missing in that narrative and that arc is that it's also interlinked and it's also interconnected. And I would also say that if it comes to something and Australia is involved in any way, tangentially or frontline, in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, by God, I'd want the Ukrainians on my side.
Yeah.
Well, Stephanie, it has been an absolute joy to talk to you. Congratulations on the book. I have to say, you made sanctions sexy. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. It was great.
5-star review.
Oh, fabulous.
Thank you. You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Bourke. You can find my work at latikambbourke.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.